Hey everybody, Terry here. I know it's been a long time since I posted any videos to this YouTube channel, and I apologize for that. I've actually been contemplating for quite some time now posting answers to some of the more interesting questions that I get for my Java course. And so this will be the first time that I will use my YouTube channel to respond to one of those questions. So if you do want more of this type of content, be sure to like and subscribe to it so that I will know that I'm doing something that you guys like, okay? All right, so here is the question that I received. The student asks, what is the difference between an API and a framework? I noticed that we have a Streams API, Java API, and other APIs in the language. Alternately, we have the Collections framework. Can you explain what the difference is between the two? All right, so I like this question. It's a great question. So honestly, I don't even know that I had ever really thought about it that far. Some of these potential, how should we call them, inconsistencies perhaps that may exist in some of these names. So the way I'm going to answer this is not by technically looking it up in some dictionary or something like that. Instead, I'm going to give you my real world sense of the difference between these two terms, API versus framework, and we'll go from there, okay? So first, let me start off with an analogy. If you think of all of the knobs and dials and buttons that exist in cars, and we call those things controls because they allow you to control various functions of the car, right? So when I think of those controls in a car, I think of them as the interface of the car. Now, let me back up and say this. The term API stands for Application Programming Interface, okay? So an API basically is the programming equivalent of the buttons and knobs and dials that you can interact with to control some type of functionality, okay? Usually an API will come with a lot of methods or functions of some sort. And if you call this function, you'll get this result or whatever. And similarly, in a car, if you push this button, something will happen. If you turn this dial, something else will happen, right? You're manipulating the functionality of the car. So that's a basic understanding of what an API is. So now, what is a framework? So to stay with this car analogy, I might think of a framework as something like a kit that you could buy that would allow you to assemble your own car. And we can imagine that this kit might come with a frame of a car, right? So just the basic outline or the frame of the car, and maybe you can fabricate your own panels to go on it. I don't know. I have no idea how car kits work, but this frame will have a placement where you are meant to put the engine. And perhaps you can choose from a certain set of engines, but perhaps you cannot place an infinite variety of engines in this car. So the idea is that with this kit, it designates where you're supposed to place certain things, okay? And perhaps this kit also standardizes on where the controls for the car are supposed to be, right? So perhaps it comes with a dashboard with pre-cut holes or something for the various buttons and things to be placed, okay? So to take this back into the programming world, frameworks, in my experience, usually give us kind of pre-designated areas where we can place certain code. They may tell us that, hey, if you place the main class that is the entry point into your program under a certain directory structure, then our framework will know to find it there and pick it up and do whatever the framework is meant to do, okay? And in the Java world, at least, almost by far, the most famous framework would be the Spring framework and Spring Boot. And the Spring framework has a lot of those kinds of things, maybe not so much where it's telling you to place your code in certain places. They maybe even perhaps eschew doing that, but they will say, hey, if you place this annotation right here over this piece of code, then we promise that we will know what that means and register that code in our framework or whatever. Okay, so Hopefully that gives you some idea of what I at least think of as somewhat classical definitions of the distinction between APIs and frameworks. Now, having said all of that, that might actually leave you more confused in terms of this question, because this person is saying, well, we've got this collections framework. Why are they calling it a framework? It's really just a combination of interfaces and classes with a bunch of cool methods that we can call. That feels more like an API. And I would say, to me, that does feel more like an API than a framework. So now let me give you one more insight, I guess, from my perspective, at least as a software developer. So I feel like, for the most part, a lot of programmers, maybe even most programmers, might not really care that much about the distinction in these two terms, really. I personally have almost certainly used the terms semi-interchangeably in certain cases where the distinction wasn't maybe quite as clear-cut in my mind, or maybe my head was already kind of in the space of talking about APIs, and so I called something that maybe technically is a framework as an API instead. Who knows? So after saying all of what I have just said, I will finish up by just telling you, I don't think you really need to worry about it too much one way or the other. I feel like it kind of doesn't really matter that much. I'm not saying that there isn't a reasonable distinction. I think I've already made the point that there kind of is a real distinction. But at the end of the day, I think all programmers are going to know what you mean, regardless of what term you use in this case. But yeah, if it were up to me, and it isn't, I don't know that I'd be calling the Java Collections Framework a framework. Oh, and one more thing. You'll also hear the term library, especially depending on what language you're talking about. And yeah, probably library, in my mind, aligns more with how I think of API rather than framework, though a library really is just shared code, right? And so the Spring framework is obtainable in the form of shared code, specifically as jar files. And jar files are the way that the Java world implements libraries. And so, yeah, I mean, there's even more blurring right there, right? If you work with someone who comes from a language like, I don't know, C and C++, where they work with things that are called libraries all the time, libraries, especially in the Java world, really can be both just pure APIs or frameworks. And I think pretty much always a framework really is going to include an API with it. There may be some exceptions that I'm not thinking of at the moment, but I think by and large, frameworks will tend to be a superset of libraries. So, all right, hopefully I didn't confuse anybody more with that answer, but there's my take on it. I hope that helps somebody, okay? And hey, if you liked anything that you heard in this video, but you want to go deeper or learn more about this kind of stuff, you should definitely check out my Java course. I teach nearly 88 hours, I think it is now, of on-demand video that doesn't spend probably this much time teaching all the distinctions of APIs versus frameworks per se, but you definitely will learn a whole lot about the collections framework and many, many other APIs and frameworks within the Java programming language. So my course is a great way to learn more about all of this kind of stuff and maybe even start a new career as a professional Java software developer if that's something you're interested in. And I also have another course teaching Unix for programmers, because having a foundational level of knowledge of Unix tends to come in super, super handy these days as modern software developers. Whether you're coding in Java or JavaScript, TypeScript, Node, Python, it doesn't really matter. You're probably going to write some kind of application that needs to be deployed onto some type of Unix server, probably a Linux server. And so you'll want to know at least the bare minimum of, how to get around in a Unix Linux environment. And so come check out that course as well. Get them both. Look for the links in the description below. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you in the next one.